Can the government stop a newspaper from publishing the truth? This question was at the heart of one of the most dramatic legal battles in American history. In 1971, the Supreme Court delivered a landmark decision in a case known as New York Times versus United States, more famously called the Pentagon Papers Case. It became a defining moment for freedom of the press, a showdown that pitted national security against the public's right to know. This story isn't just about a court case. It's about the very foundation of a free and open society. To understand the immense pressure and the high stakes of this conflict, we have to go back to the height of the Vietnam War. It was a deeply divisive time in America. Protests filled the streets, and a generation was questioning the government's involvement in a conflict halfway across the world. Inside the halls of power, a massive top-secret study was commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Its official title was History of U.S. Decision-Making in Vietnam, 1945-68. This collection of documents, later known as the Pentagon Papers, spanned 47 volumes and contained over 7,000 pages of classified material. What did these papers reveal? They contained a bombshell. The study showed, in meticulous detail, that multiple presidential administrations, from Truman to Johnson, had systematically lied to the American public and to Congress. They had deliberately escalated the war, concealed their true intentions, and painted a far rosier picture of the conflict's progress than reality dictated. The documents proved that the government knew the war was likely unwinnable, even as they sent more and more young soldiers to fight and die. The man who brought these secrets to light was Daniel Ellsberg, a military analyst who had worked on the study. Initially a supporter of the war, Ellsberg became disillusioned after seeing firsthand the deception documented in the papers. He believed the American people had a right to know the truth about a war being fought in their name. So, in an act of incredible bravery, he secretly photocopied thousands of pages of the report. For months, he tried to get members of Congress to release the information, but no one would risk it. Finally, he turned to the press. In June of 1971, the New York Times began publishing excerpts from the Pentagon Papers. The first article hit the front page like a thunderclap. For the first time, the public was seeing undeniable proof of the government's long-term deception. The Nixon administration was furious. Attorney General John Mitchell, on behalf of President Nixon, demanded that the Times halt publication, citing a threat to national security. The government argued that releasing these classified documents would cause irreparable injury to the defense interests of the United States. When the New York Times refused to stop, the government did something almost unprecedented in American history. It sought a court order to block the newspaper from publishing further articles. This is a legal concept known as prior restraint, censoring information before it's even published. In the United States, prior restraint is seen as the most extreme and dangerous form of censorship, a direct violation of the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of the press. The government's action set the stage for a monumental legal battle. A federal court initially granted a temporary restraining order against the Times, but the fight was far from over. Seeing the Times temporarily silenced, Daniel Ellsberg leaked more of the papers to the Washington Post, which immediately began publishing its own series of articles. The government then went after the Post, and soon, other newspapers across the country joined in, creating a nationwide constitutional crisis. The core conflict was crystal clear. Does the government's need to protect national security outweigh the press's constitutional right to inform the public? Or was national security just a convenient excuse to hide political embarrassment and government misconduct? The case moved through the legal system at breathtaking speed. Within just 2 weeks of the first article being published, the case landed at the steps of the Supreme Court. The atmosphere was electric. The nation's highest court had to decide, and decide quickly, where the line should be drawn. Lawyers for the newspapers argued that a free press is one of the most vital checks on government power. It serves as a watchdog, holding officials accountable. If the government could stop publications simply by claiming national security, then the First Amendment would be rendered meaningless. Any embarrassing or incriminating information could be suppressed, leaving the public in the dark. The government's lawyers, on the other hand, argued that the president has the inherent authority to protect the nation from grave and irreparable harm. They insisted that the release of the Pentagon Papers could compromise intelligence sources, endanger American troops, and undermine diplomatic efforts to end the war. The fate of press freedom in America hung in the balance. On June 30th, 1971, the Supreme Court issued its ruling. In a 6-3 decision, the court sided with the New York Times and the Washington Post. The justices lifted the government's injunctions, allowing the newspapers to resume publication. While the justices wrote 9 separate opinions, the majority's message was powerful. They declared that there is a heavy presumption against the constitutionality of prior restraint. The government, they said, had failed to meet this heavy burden of proof. It had not shown that publishing the papers would cause a direct, immediate, and irreparable danger to the nation. Justice Hugo Black wrote one of the most powerful and oft-quoted opinions in the case. He stated, "The press was to serve the governed, not the governors. The government's power to censor the press was abolished so that the press would remain forever free to censure the government." Justice William O. Douglas added that secrecy in government is fundamentally perpetuating bureaucratic errors. Even jasus, who were more sympathetic to the government's security concerns, acknowledged the high bar for censorship. Justice Potter Stewart famously wrote that while he was convinced the publication could cause some harm, he couldn't say that it would surely result in direct, immediate, and irreparable damage to our nation or its people. Without that certainty, the First Amendment had to prevail. The aftermath of the ruling was immediate and profound. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and other papers resumed publishing the Pentagon Papers, revealing the full extent of the government's deceptions to a stunned nation. The case didn't end the Vietnam War overnight, but it significantly eroded public trust in the government's handling of it and bolstered the anti-war movement. The Pentagon Papers case has had a lasting legacy. It reaffirmed the vital role of a free and independent press as a watchdog against government overreach and secrecy. It established an incredibly high legal standard for the government to meet. If it ever wants to censor the press, the ruling sent a clear message. The government cannot use vague claims of national security to cover up its mistakes, its lies, or its embarrassing secrets. The pursuit of truth, especially when it concerns the actions of our own government, is not a threat to democracy. It is essential to it. The lesson from New York Times versus United States is more relevant today than ever. In an age of instant information and widespread misinformation, the principles of a free press and government transparency are constantly being tested. This case reminds us that a government that operates in the shadows, free from public scrutiny, is a danger to the very freedoms it's supposed to protect. The truth isn't always comfortable, and it's not always convenient, but it belongs to the people, and a courageous press is often the only thing standing between that truth and the powerful forces that want to keep it hidden. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of America's most important legal battles. If you want to discover more stories where justice and freedom were on the line, make sure to follow my channel. We'll continue to explore the cases that shaped our world and defended our democracy. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next story.